Welcome to Lesson 2 of the GRE Prep coursework. Today I'm going to talk about verbal and quantitative reasoning sections in a little bit more depth than last time. And I'm also going to discuss strategies to answer individual types of questions. Let's talk about the verbal reasoning section. As we discussed last time, there are two sets of 25 questions each in this section. There are some features in the software that help you do your job a little better because it keeps account of all the questions that you have answered. So it has a mark feature which enables you to mark the questions that you would like to come back to revise or edit or reconsider. There is a review feature which lets you view a complete list of all the questions in that section. It will give a count of how many you have answered and how many still need your attention. And it has a skip feature where you can skip questions that you are having difficulty in answering. You can always come back to those questions if there's enough time left. Let's talk about some test-taking strategies that you can use to get the best possible score for yourself. Your score is determined by the number of questions that you answer correctly. There's no negative marking, and therefore it's best to answer every question. Even if you have to take a wild guess, take it. You never know, maybe your guess will be correct. No question carries greater weight than any other, so you can skip the extremely difficult or the unfamiliar questions and return to them later. If you do not have enough time later, you can always wild guess. It's a good idea to go through the section rapidly, stopping only to answer the questions that you know for sure you know the answers to, and then go back and answer the questions that need more time and more attention and thought. However, make sure you do the best for each section, because once you're done with one section, you're not allowed to return to it. So you work only on one section at a time for the time allowed. Reading comprehension questions are designed to test a wide variety of abilities that you will need to read and understand the kinds of prose that you will encounter in graduate school. So this test is actually preparing you for graduate school. These abilities include understanding meaning of individual words, individual sentences, paragraphs, and large bodies of text, distinguishing between minor and major points, summarizing a passage, drawing conclusions from the information provided, reasoning from incomplete data, inferring missing information, understanding the structure of a text, identifying the author's perspective and assumptions, analyzing a text and drawing conclusions from it, identifying strengths and weaknesses, and developing and considering alternative explanations. These are all the abilities that are being tested when you attempt a reading comprehension passage question. Let's talk about some tips to approach a reading comprehension passage. Before you try to attempt any question, read and analyze the passage carefully. Look for clues that help you understand the weaker aspects of the passage. Try to distinguish the main idea from a supporting idea. Just try to distinguish what the author is actually reporting and what he's or she is advancing. Try to distinguish what the author is strongly committed to from those he or she advances as hypothetical or speculative. Identify the relationship between different ideas, if they're contrasting, if they're consistent, if they support each other, or one is an application of the other. Then read each question carefully and be certain to understand exactly what is being asked. Answer the questions on the basis of information and content provided in the passage. Do not rely on outside knowledge. So if you're familiar with a subject, don't apply your own knowledge. The question is asking you to read the passage and answer the question on the basis of what the author thinks. Let's take a look at an example. The painter Peter Brandon never dated his works, and their chronology is only now beginning to take shape in the critical literature. A recent dating of a Brandon self-portrait to 1930 is surely wrong. Brandon was 63 years old in 1930, yet the painting shows a young, dark-haired man, obviously Brandon, but clearly not a man of 63. Here's a question about the passage. This is a select only one answer choice question, and therefore 1 out of 5 answers is correct. Which of the following, if justifiably assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly drawn? How do you approach answering this type of question? Let's take a look at some tips. Before making a selection, make sure you read all the answer choices, even if you think you know which answer is correct. Sometimes a later choice might be a better fit to the question. Don't be misled by answer choices that are only partially true or partially answer the question. There will be answer choices like this to confuse you. The correct answer is the one that most completely and accurately answers the question asked. Therefore, don't pick an answer choice simply because it's a true statement. It might not apply to the question at all. Pay attention to context. When the question is asking about a meaning of a word in the passage, make sure your answer choice correctly represents the way the word is being used in the passage. For example, many words have different meanings in different contexts. Make sure you select the answer based on the context. Okay, keeping these tips in mind, let's try to answer this question now. Which of the following, if justifiably assumed, allows the conclusion to be properly drawn? Choice A. There is no securely dated self-portrait of Brandon that he painted when he was significantly younger than 63. B. In refraining from dating his works, Brandon intended to steer critical discussion of them away from considerations of chronology. C. Until recently, there was very little critical literature on the works of Brandon. D. Brandon at age 63 would not have portrayed himself in a painting as he had looked when he was a young man. Brandon painted several self-portraits that showed him as a man past the age of 60. Now, after reading the passage, we can easily conclude that the self-portrait must have been improperly dated. And that's proof enough for the discrepancy between Brandon's age of 63 in 1930 and his youthful appearance in the paintings. There's one assumption to be made here, though. A self-portrait depicts the artist's current appearance. So if Brandon would have painted the self-portrait at the age of 63, he would have looked much older than that in the painting. Now, since the argument does not depend on the existence or absence of other self-portraits, choices A and E are incorrect. The argument also doesn't depend on Brandon's motivation for not dating his works or upon the lack of literature about his work, and therefore choices B and C are incorrect. That leaves us with choice D. Brandon at age 63 would not have portrayed himself in a painting as he had looked when he was a young man. That is in fact the correct answer. Let's look at another reading comprehension passage. The binary planet hypothesis that Earth and the Moon formed simultaneously by the accretion of small objects does not explain why the Moon's iron core is so small relative to the Moon's total volume compared with Earth's core relative to Earth's total volume. According to the giant impact hypothesis, the moon was created during a collision between Earth and a large object about the size of Mars. Computer simulations of this impact show that both of the objects would melt in the impact and the dense core of the impactor would fall as molten rock into the liquefied iron core of Earth. The ejected matter, mantle rock that has surrounded the cores of both objects, would be almost devoid of iron. This matter would become the moon. Alright, here's the question associated with this passage. For the following question, consider each of the choices separately and select all that apply. So this is a select more than one correct answer type question. And the question is, according to the passage, the binary planet of hypothesis holds that choice A, Earth and the moon were formed at the same time. Choice B, smaller objects joined together to form Earth and the moon. And choice C, the moon's core is the same absolute size as Earth's core. How do we approach answering this type of question? Let's look at some tips. For select one or more answer choices, evaluate each answer choice separately on its own merit. When evaluating one choice, do not take the others into account. Make sure the answer choice that you pick completely and accurately answers the question asked. Don't be misled by answer choices that are partially true or those that only partially answer the question. Also, do not pick an answer choice simply because it's a true statement. It might not apply to the passage. Don't be disturbed if you think all three answers are correct, because questions of this type can have all three correct answer choices. Now let's try to answer this question. According to the passage, the binary planet hypothesis holds that. Now, if you look at the passage, the first sentence of the passage says the binary planet hypothesis holds that Earth and Moon formed simultaneously, which means choice A, Earth and the Moon were formed at the same time, is correct. The first sentence also says that the Earth and the Moon are formed by accretion or joining together of smaller objects, which makes choice B, smaller objects joined together to form Earth and the Moon, also correct. Choice C is the Moon's core is the same absolute size as Earth's core. Now the passage does not mention anything about the absolute size of Earth and Moon's cores. It only compares sizes relative to the volumes of the two objects. So choice C is incorrect. Therefore, the correct answer to this question is choice A and B. And finally, another type of question that you might see on reading passage questions is selecting a particular sentence. Let's look at an example here. Reviving the practice of using elements of popular music in classical composition, an approach that had been in hibernation in the United States during the 1960s, composer Philip Glass embraced the ethos of popular music in his compositions. Glass based two symphonies on music by rock musicians David Bowie and Brian Eno, but the symphony's sound is distinctively his. Popular elements do not appear out of place in Glass's classical music, which from its early days has shared certain harmonies and rhythms with rock music. Yet this use of popular elements has not made Glass a composer of popular music. His music is not a version of the popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It is high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics. And the question is, select the sentence that distinguishes two ways of integrating rock and classical music. What is the strategy to answer this type of question? So in order to answer select a sentence in passage type of question, before selecting your answer, make sure you evaluate each of the relevant sentences in the passage separately. In case the passage consists of more than one paragraph, Do not evaluate any sentences that are outside the paragraphs under consideration. Do not select a sentence if the description given in the question only partially applies. A correct answer choice must actually match the description in the question. However, that description need not be complete. There may be aspects of the sentence that are not fully described in the question. So to select a sentence that distinguishes two ways of integrating rock and classical music, we look at each sentence of this paragraph carefully, and almost every sentence in this passage refers to incorporating rock music in classical compositions, but only the last sentence distinguishes two ways of doing so. It distinguishes between writing rock music in a way that will make it attractive to classical listeners and writing classical music that will make it attractive to listeners familiar with rock. And therefore, the correct answer to this question is the last sentence of this paragraph. His music is not a version of popular music packaged to attract classical listeners. It's high art for listeners steeped in rock rather than the classics. Moving on, the next type of questions that you'll see on the verbal reasoning section are the sentence equivalence questions. Let's take a look at how these types of questions are answered. Although it does contain some pioneering ideas, one would hardly characterize the work as blank. How do you approach answering this question? To answer sentence equivalence questions, do not simply look among the answer choices for two words that mean the same thing. It's possible that you might find two sets of words that have the same meaning, like the one example that we are just about to see. Read the sentence to get an overall sense of it, and identify words or phrases that seem significant, either because they emphasize the structure of the sentence with words like although or moreover, or because they are central to understanding what the sentence is about. Think up your own words for these blanks. You try to fill the blank with a word that you think might fit, and then look at the answer choices for two similar words that have the same meaning. And make sure you double check your answers. When you select a pair of answer choices for the blank, make sure that each of these words produce a sentence that's logical, grammatically correct, and coherent, and that the two sentences mean the same thing. Now let's try to answer this question. Although it does contain some pioneering ideas, one would hardly characterize the work as blank. Now the word although is crucial here, and according to the sentence, the work contains some pioneering ideas, but the overall work cannot be deemed pioneering. And therefore, because of the presence of word although, the blank will fit something that is indicative of pioneering. Let's look at the answer choices. Orthodox, eccentric, original, trifling, conventional, innovative. Now you might have noticed that there are two sets of words that have the same meaning. Orthodox and conventional mean the same, but do they fit the blank? No, they don't. Although it does contain some pioneering ideas, one would hardly characterize the work as orthodox. No, that doesn't fit. What is the other set of words that have the same meaning? Original and innovative. Although it does contain some pioneering ideas, one would hardly characterize the word as original. So yes, the words that fit the blank are original and innovative, and therefore choices C and F are correct. Let's take a look at another example of a sentence equivalence question. It was her view that the country's problems had been blank by foreign technocrats, so that to ask for such assistance again would be counterproductive. Now, what is our catch word or phrase here? It's so that. This sentence relates a piece of reasoning, and therefore asking for the assistance of these foreign technocrats would be counterproductive because of the effects that they might have had in the past. And the sentence indicates that technocrats must have had bad effects. What are the two words that mean bad or are synonymous to that? Let's look at the answer choices. Ameliorated, ascertained, diagnosed, exacerbated, overlooked, worsened. Now, the two words that are synonymous to bad are exacerbated and worsened. Let's try to fit these in the blank. It was her view that the country's problem had been worsened by foreign technocrats so that to ask for such assistance again would be counterproductive. Yes, worsened fits. And a synonym of worsen is exacerbated, and therefore the correct answers are D and F. And finally, the third type of question that you'll see on verbal reasoning are the text completion questions. Let's take a look at an example and how to approach the question. Vain and prone to violence, Caravaggio could not handle success. The more his blank as an artist increased, the more blank his life became. Now there are choices, three choices each for each blank, and there'll be one correct answer. Remember, there is no partial credit for one correct answer to a blank. Both the answers have to be correct in order to get the question correct. How do you approach text completion questions? Let's take a look. Do not merely try to consider each possible combination of answers, because that's going to take too long and that process is open to error. Instead, read through the passage or the sentence carefully, get an overall sense of it, identify words like although, moreover, words that are particularly significant, just as we did in sentence equivalence questions, and then think up your own words for the blanks. Once you figure out what the blanks should have, look in the answer choices and look if there are words with similar meanings. Do not assume that the first blank is the first one that should be filled. Maybe it is easier to fill the other blanks, and once you select your choices for that blank, then it'll be a piece of cake to figure out what the first blank will have. Double check your answers. When you've made a selection for each blank, read the passage or the sentence. Make sure it's logical, grammatically correct, and it's coherent. Now let's try to attempt this question. Vain and prone to violence, Caravaggio could not handle success. The more his blank as an artist increased, the more blank his life became. Now what follows the colon sign must explain what precedes it. And judging by the first part of the sentence, we can predict that the second part of the sentence might say that as Caravaggio became more successful, his life got more out of control. Now, in blank 2, what is a word that would mean out of control? The choices are tumultuous, providential, dispassionate. Now, choices E and F don't apply here at all. And choice D, tumultuous, is the best fit for the second blank. Now that we know that his life became tumultuous, what would be the best fit for blank 1? Now the choices are temperance, notoriety, eminence. The consequences of becoming successful is basically an indication of eminence. It's true that Caravaggio might also increase in notoriety, but increase in notoriety is not a sign of success. And so the best fit for blank 1 is eminence. The correct answers are choices C and D. So this was an overview of how to approach the exact type of questions in verbal reasoning. Let's move on to the quantitative reasoning section. As we discussed last time, you will have 2 sets of 25 questions each, and you'll get 40 minutes per section. The types of questions that you'll see on quantitative reasoning are quantitative comparison, numeric entry, and multiple choice questions, either with one correct answer or more. Let's discuss each of these types at length. Here is a typical quantitative comparison question. You're given a fact. In this case, the fact is Mary is younger than Grace. And then you are given two quantities that are defined for you in the question. Quantity A is twice Mary's age, and quantity B is Grace's age. And the choices of answers that you have are quantity A is greater, quantity B is greater. The two quantities are equal. The relationship cannot be determined from the information provided. Now, this question is a very simple version of quantitative comparison question. But on the test, you'll see much more difficult and tricky questions for this category. So how do you approach answering this type of question? Here are some tips that you can keep in mind while answering quantitative comparison questions. Needless to say, become familiar with the answer choices. Quantitative comparison questions, by default, have the same choices for every question that you'll see on the test. It's quantity A is greater, quantity B is greater, the two quantities are equal, or the relationship cannot be determined from the information provided. Don't select relationship cannot be determined if the values of the two quantities can be determined by computation. Also, make sure you select the correct answer out of A and B choices. It's easy to get them reversed once you have the answers calculated. Avoid unnecessary computations. So don't waste time in getting to a correct answer. What you need is to figure out if A is greater, B is greater, or if they're equal. So you simplify, transform, or estimate these quantities only as much as it's necessary to compare them. Also, as I discussed last time, remember that the geometric figures are not necessarily drawn to scale. So if there is an aspect of a figure that's not fully determined, you redraw the figure. You keep the aspects that are determined fixed, but change the aspects of the figure that are not determined, and then see the results. What could be the possible variations in the relative lengths of line or measures of angle? That might change your answer. Plug in numbers. If one or both quantities are algebraic expressions, it's much easier to substitute numbers instead of variables and then compare the quantities. But make sure you read the question carefully. Sometimes, if there's no specification, you must try putting in positive numbers, negative numbers, small numbers, large numbers, fractions, decimals, zero. Make sure you cover all the possibilities, unless it's specified otherwise. Some questions will specify that the numbers are only positive. Then you don't need to, cover all the possibilities. But if it doesn't say so, and that's usually the trick in most questions, you need to cover all the possibilities. Simplify the comparison. Now, if you have algebraic or arithmetic expressions, and if you don't see an obvious relationship between them, then you can try to simplify it. For example, 2x minus 3 is equal to 5. You simplify it, x is equal to 4, and then compare it to the other quantity and see which one is greater. If it's not clear which quantity is greater, you can set up a comparison. Write quantity A on one side, quantity B on the other, and then use a question mark as a placeholder. It can represent any relationship, either greater than, less than, equal to, or relationship cannot be determined. Then you simplify the comparison step by step until you determine a relationship. We will discuss more about this in the upcoming classes. Coming back to the question, Mary is younger than Grace. Quantity A is twice Mary's age, quantity B is Grace's age. Let's try to plug in some numbers and see if any one of these quantities is greater or not. If Mary is, let's say, 6 years old and Grace is 10 years old, twice Mary's age would be 2 times 6, which is 12, and quantity B would be 10. That makes quantity A greater. Now let's assume Mary is 4 years old and Grace is 10 years old. In this case, quantity A is 2 times 4, which is 8, and quantity B is 10, making quantity B greater than A. Since we cannot determine a relationship between the two quantities, the correct answer for this question is choice D. Relationship cannot be determined from the information provided. Let's take a look at another example of a quantitative comparison question. You're not given a fact in this one. You're just provided with two quantities A and B, and you're asked to determine the relationship between them. Quantity A is inverse of 3 over inverse of 4, which is basically equal to 4 by 3. Quantity B is 4 by 3. And therefore, the correct answer is C. The two quantities are equal. Another type of question that you see on quantitative reasoning is a multiple choice question with a single correct answer. Let's take a look at an example. If 5x plus 32 is equal to 4 minus 2x, what is the value of x? You're given 5 choices, one of which is correct. How do you approach a multiple choice question in quantitative reasoning? Let's take a look. You use the fact that the answer is already there. If your calculated answer is not one of the 5 answer choices provided, then you know that there is something wrong. In that case, you reread the question. You might have missed an important detail or misinterpreted some information. You check your calculations and you reevaluate the method that you've used to come to the answer. Secondly, you examine the answer choices. In some questions, you are specifically asked which of the answer choices has a certain property. In those cases, you need to go through the answer choices first and see if they match the question. In other cases, it might be helpful to work backward from the choices. That means substitute the choices in an equation or inequality to see which one works. And finally, some questions require approximations, so you scan the answer choices to see how close an approximation is needed. In some cases, the answers are so far apart in terms of values that it's easy to guess the correct answer. In others, you might need a full calculation. In those cases, it may be necessary to carry out all the calculation exactly and then round only your final answer to get the required degree of accuracy. But in other questions, you may find that the estimation is sufficient and it will help you save a lot of time in doing long calculations. Now let's try to attempt this question. If 5x plus 32 is equal to 4 minus 2x, what is the value of x? It would be much easier to solve this equation instead of inserting the answer choices one by one into the equation. And so simplifying will save a lot of time. On the left hand corner is how it's simplified. The x's come to one side and the numericals go to the other. 5x plus 2x is equal to 4 minus 32. You add 5x and 2x to get 7x. You subtract 4 minus 32 to get minus 28. You divide both sides by 7 and you get x is equal to minus 4. It's interesting to note that the answers are designed strategically because the answers have choices that you might end up if you forget to carry forward a sign or you forget to change the sign. For example, if you forget 4 minus 32, instead of writing minus 28, you accidentally write 28, you'll end up getting x is equal to 4. Or if you, instead of 5x plus 2x, you write 5x minus 2x, and instead of 4 minus 32, you write 4 plus 32, then you might end up getting answer x is equal to 12. And if you look at the answer choices carefully, all those choices are there. They are there to confuse you. And so be very careful when you solve an equation or do a calculation, because the answers are also tricky. In this case, the correct answer is choice A, minus 4. Another kind of multiple choice question is select one or more answer choices. Let's take a look at an example. A student made a conjecture that for any integer n, the integer 4n plus 3 is a prime number. Which of the following values of n could be used to disprove the student's conjecture? Indicate all such values. How do you approach a multiple choice question with one or more correct answers? Remember to check whether you are asked to indicate a specific number of answer choices or asked to select all choices that apply. If you're asked to select all choices that apply, make sure you consider all of the choices, determine which ones are correct, and select all of those and only those choices. There may be only one correct answer out of 8, there might be 7 out of 8 correct. Therefore, it's important to check all the choices. In some questions that involve conditions that limit the possible values of numerical answer choices, it may be efficient to determine the least or the greatest possible value. Once you figure out the least or the greatest possible value, you can determine all of the other choices that are correct. You can avoid lengthy calculations by recognizing and continuing numerical patterns. Now let's try to attempt this question. Student made a conjecture that for any integer n, the integer 4n plus 3 is a prime number. Which of the following values of n could be used to disprove the student's conjecture? So what is a prime number? As you know, prime number is an integer greater than 1 that has no positive divisors other than 1 in itself. So any answer choice for which the integer 4n plus 3 is not a prime number could be used to disprove the student's conjecture. So to answer, you determine for each of the answer choices whether the integer 4n plus 3 is a prime number or not. This is one of those questions where you use the answer choices to select the correct answers. And so for choice A, where n is equal to 1, 4n plus 3 is equal to 7. For n is equal to 3, 4n plus 3 is equal to 15. For n is equal to 4, 4n plus 3 is equal to 19. For n is equal to 6, 4n plus 3 is equal to 27. For n is equal to 7, 4n plus 3 is equal to 31. Out of these 5, 7, 19, and 31 are prime numbers, and 15 and 27 are not. So which values of n can be used to disprove the student's conjecture? It's 15 and 27, choices B and D. The correct answers are 3 and 6. And finally, the third type of questions in quantitative reasoning are numeric entry questions, in which you're just given a box, you need to fill a value, you don't have any answer choices, so you don't have any clues. This makes these questions a little bit harder, but there are strategies to tackle these questions. Here's an example. A merchant made a profit of $5 on the sale of a sweater that cost the merchant $15. What is the profit expressed as a percent of the merchant's cost? Give your answer to the nearest whole percent. Let's look at some tips to how to answer numeric entry questions. Make sure you answer the question that is asked. Since there are no answer choices to guide you, You need to read the question carefully and make sure you provide the type of answer required. Sometimes there will be labels before or after the answer box to indicate what type of answer is needed. Pay attention to the units, such as feet or miles, and to percents compared with decimals. Make sure your calculations are correct. If you're asked to round your answer, make sure you round to the required degree of accuracy. For example, if an answer of 46.7 is to be rounded to the nearest integer, you need to enter 47 in the box and not 46. Carry out all computations exactly and round only the final answer in order to get the required degree of accuracy. If there are no instructions about rounding the answer, enter the exact answer. Now let's try to attempt this question. Merchant made a profit of $5 on the sale of a sweater that cost him $15. What is the profit expressed as a percent of the merchant's cost? Give your answer to the nearest whole percent. Now the percent sign next to the answer box indicates that the form of answer needed is in percent. Now what is the percent profit? 5, which is the profit, divided by 15, which was the cost price, times 100 is the percent profit. It's equal to 33.333 or 33.3%. Now the instructions clearly say give your answer to the nearest whole percent. And so the nearest whole percent of 33.3 would be 33. If you would type 0.33, express it as a decimal, that would be wrong because the answer required is as percent. So this is why it's very important to read the instructions in numeric entry questions. So this is all I have for today. In the next lecture, we will discuss all levels of questions, easy, medium, and hard, for the verbal section, followed by the quantitative reasoning section in the following lecture. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to write to me at the address provided, and wish you all the best. Thank you for your attention.